This is David Leffler, the host of Fumed. Before we get started, consider donating to Public Health Watch, the nonprofit news outlet that produced this podcast. Investigative reporting is expensive, and we need your support to keep it going. Go to publichealthwatch.org to contribute. Thank you. April of 2007 was a typical spring in Southeast Texas. Bluebonnets, the state flower, painted streaks of color on pastures and roadside knolls. People soaked up as much time outside as they could before the punishing summer heat arrived. In Channelview, however, nature's gifts were overshadowed by a frenzy of petrochemical activity. The riverside community's transformation into an industrial hotbed was speeding up. The changes were dramatic in South Channelview. Homes on the banks of the San Jacinto River were being replaced by storage facilities filled with hazardous materials. 300-foot-long chemical barges were lined up next to a waterfront park where families used to swim. Instead of the screeching of seagulls, residents heard ship engines churning and 18-wheelers grinding through narrow neighborhood streets. Tensions were especially high in the Lakeview Homes neighborhood, where Carolyn and Bobby Stone lived across the street from the river. They were among the handful of longtime residents who hadn't sold out to the barge companies.
Our neighborhoods are within just a few feet from a chemical cocktail of barges, lashed side by side all the way up and down the banks on both sides and in the middle of the river. Even first responders aren't aware of all the different chemicals that are in there. We have them literally at our front door, and we have no protections between us and them.
I'm David Leffler. From Public Health Watch, this is Fumed, an investigative podcast about the people who live in the shadows of America's chemical plants and oil refineries. This season, a group of stubborn Texans try to salvage what's left of their working-class community. That's a problem, though, because they live in East Harris County, where the petrochemical industry calls the shots. In this episode, two of those stubborn people, Carolyn Stone and Greg Moss, are clinging to the faint hope that someone will step up to save what remains of the Channelview they once knew. But as the years pass, they begin to realize that if nobody else is going to step in, maybe they'll have to. Part 2. Birth of the Activists. Channelview's changing landscape was on everyone's mind. Most of the conversations, over coffee at Mom's Country Cafe, dinner at El Tejano, or beers at the Starlight Bar, had the sting of resignation to them. What was the point of fighting back? Channelview is unincorporated, so its 40,000 or so residents didn't have a mayor or city council to lobby for them. There weren't any big community organizations either. In times of hardship, people just banded together and took care of each other. The VFW organized barbecue benefit dinners. The school district held food drives and distributed bottled water. But that informal support system was no match for the politically connected petrochemical industry that was swallowing up their community, lot by lot. What worried people most was the army of barges invading Channelview. By the spring of 2007, more than 50 barges were parked along the mile-and-a-half stretch of river that borders Carolyn's neighborhood. Others were clustered near the Interstate 10 bridge that separates North and South Channelview. The first time I saw the barges, I was astounded by their size.
They're 11 feet tall. And keep in mind the barges are constructed with these big kind of metal bases that, are pretty worn. They're cracked and rusting. But then on top of the actual kind of that shell itself is where all of the kind of chemical storage infrastructure is on it.
They were as long as football fields and rose roughly 15 feet above the water. But once they're fully loaded, they're practically submerged. Some barges have flat tops covered with a maze of pipes and valves. Others have what look like giant propane tanks on their tops. They were completely silent, but that silence didn't mean they weren't dangerous. Because barges store and transport highly combustible chemicals, they have to release, or vent, chemical vapors into the air. That keeps them from turning into chemical-filled pressure cookers. Clean air experts later told me that even a nearly empty barge can release chemicals into the air. That's because leftover chemicals can stick to its interior walls and accumulate at the bottom of its huge storage tank. Eventually, that gunk releases toxic vapors. I've been to Channelview a lot since then. I'm no longer shocked when I see a fleet of barges on the San Jacinto. But imagine having 50 barges bunched together in a narrow stretch of river across the street from your house. That's what Carolyn was facing, and what Greg was trying to avoid. Carolyn was also worried about the industrial facility at the end of her street. It was now a chemical distribution and barge cleaning business owned by a Houston-based company, K-Solve. And it was expanding. Nearly 24 chemical storage tanks sat at its center. Tanker trucks loaded with hazardous materials rumbled into the neighborhood. Barges were parked on the property's eastern bank. But Carolyn was so focused on her first grandchild that she pretty much ignored the K-Solve facility.
Oh, it was amazing. I mean, when he was born, to me, everybody says this, but he was perfect. It was such an experience to see him born and then to take care of him and help my daughter out.
Her daughter would drop off her grandson, and they'd play in the backyard for hours.
We got him a little, one of those play Jeeps. Got a picture of him. He's got the hood open, working on it. So, in his diapers, So it was fun, and he liked the plants, so he would help me out in the garden.
Being a grandmother reminded Carolyn why she'd moved into her home all those years ago. But on the afternoon of April 19th, 2007, Carolyn was reminded just how much Channelview had changed since those early days. A tanker truck at K-Solve burst into flames as it was being loaded with xylene, a highly explosive liquid found in paint thinners and coatings. A plume of smoke shot into the sky. Homes shook. Ash covered front yards and cars. Fire engines raced through South Channelview's narrow streets. The blaze was quickly extinguished, but the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, or TCEQ, later reported that chemicals were released into the air for more than 24 hours. A K-Solve spokesperson told me the fire was caused by an employee who didn't follow company policy. They said that after the accident, new technology was installed and training was stepped up. Carolyn and Bobby were visiting their daughter in the Houston suburb of Atascocita when a neighbor called to tell them what happened. Their home was covered in debris, but it was still standing. Carolyn was grateful that her children had moved away from Channelview.
Our grandkids being at the house and stuff, it's like, well, is it really safe for you to be here? If they had been at our house when the incident occurred, I would have had them out of there so fast.
For the first time in her life, she wondered if she and Bobby should leave too.
There was some things we were going to do to the house and stuff. And it was like, okay, do we spend the money on the house or do we start trying to save that money so we can get the hay out of here?
But she brushed that feeling aside. This was her home. She was there first. Why should she have to leave? Barges had also moved closer to the river bottom, the marshy, overgrown piece of northeast Channelview where Greg Moss lived. There were few things Greg loved more than walking down to the river on a quiet morning, or feeling the cool spray of water on his face when he took a boat out on the San Jacinto. But those meditative moments on the water became rare after the 1994 flood that ruptured a pipeline and set the river on fire. So many people had stopped boating near the river bottom that he decided to retire from the boat repair business for good.
When I first got here on a Sunday afternoon, there's so many trucks and trailers. It would take you 30 or 40 minutes to get your boat in or out of the water. There was a huge difference in the amount of boat traffic before and after the 94 flood on this river. Huge difference, down to about a third.
Greg had hoped the I-10 bridge would act as a sort of barrier and stop the river bottom from becoming a barge depot, the way Carolyn's neighborhood had. And for many years, it did. But by the summer of 2014, dozens of barges were parked at a small shipyard just north of the bridge.
You don't know what's on them things. And these barges, they got the same chemicals they got in them damn refineries. It could be full of something that's explosive. And if they have an accident, it blows up. There's houses right there. You know, there's people right there.
Greg couldn't stop thinking about how vulnerable his world had become. Flooding in the river bottom was only getting worse. What would happen if a barge broke loose and hit the bridge? Or dumped a load of chemicals into his neighborhood? Or, even worse, started another river fire? After the 94 flood and fire, Greg bought a small plot of land about a quarter mile from the San Jacinto. His manufactured home, his workshop filled with tools, the abandoned dogs he took in, they were all there. Thanks to some savings, a little money he'd inherited from his dad, and disability benefits from his time in the Air Force, everything he owned was paid for. Still, if disaster struck, if another fire roared through the river bottom and veered onto his land, Greg would be in trouble. He didn't have fire or flood insurance for his manufactured home, and he didn't have enough money to start over. He was vulnerable, and he knew it.
There's a lot of things that can happen that I could lose my ass on. I'm just looking at the bay and the Gulf and all that and hoping we don't have any more hurricanes because I can't take another hit. I just can't afford it. You know, I can't afford it anymore.
I saw Greg whenever I went to Channelview.
Hey, Greg, how you doing?
We talked a lot under the buzzing lights of his workshop, about his brief tenure as a married man.
It was only like 3 years, but because the military's not nowhere for anybody to be married.
About life in general.
Got to have fun in life. You only get to do one thing one time. You can't just sit around and say, well, I wish I'd have done it. You might as well just go do it.
Sometimes we'd eat together. Sometimes we'd sit outside his house while my dog Deanie chased squirrels.
They're muscadines.
Can I eat that?
Well, yeah, get one of the purple ones, the darker purple ones. All my friends come over here and
Wow, that's great.
we've been making jelly and moonshine and wine and all that stuff.
Or we'd just stand in parking lots and talk for hours. On one of my visits, Greg brought up something I hadn't heard about before. There were 2 toxic waste pits just down the river from his home. One pit is a bit south of the I-10 bridge. The other is just north of the bridge, about a mile from Greg's house, and less than 2,000 feet from the rapidly expanding barge shipyard that was worrying him. The pits contained sludge that an old paper mill dumped there in the 1960s. And the sludge contained dioxin. Dioxin can cause cancer. It can also cause reproductive problems, damage the immune system, and interfere with the hormonal system, leading to thyroid disease, diabetes, and developmental disorders in children. Dioxin is best known for its connection to Agent Orange, which the U.S. infamously used during the Vietnam War.
The deadly chemical dioxin in Agent Orange.
Just the name of it evokes all sorts of horrible images.
It was one way we were going to win the Vietnam War, dump herbicides all over the jungle so the Viet Cong would come out and fight.
The paper mill originally dumped its waste on land. But over time, the northern pit was submerged by the San Jacinto's rising waters. Dioxin began leaking into the river where people swam, into the fish, crab, and shrimp they ate, and into the wells that some families relied on for drinking water. It wasn't until 2008 that the pits were designated a federal Superfund site. That's a big deal. Superfund sites are hazardous waste areas identified by the federal government as some of the most toxic places in the country.
An alarming discovery by the EPA. Superfund site along the San Jacinto River contaminated with toxic chemicals. The toxicity is reaching levels well above what's considered safe.
The Superfund site loaded with 17,000 truckloads of dioxin waste.
At first, the news that there was a Superfund site nearby didn't make much of a ripple in Channelview.
When we were younger, we used to go ride three-wheelers and four-wheelers and things down there. And we had no idea what it was. And then all of a sudden, the EPA was turning it into a Superfund site, and nobody ever told us nothing.
Greg didn't hear about the waste pits until 2011, when a TV news story announced that Harris County was suing the old paper mill and other responsible parties. A few weeks later, a friend told him the EPA was holding public meetings.
And he says, how come you don't go to those EPA meetings? I said, what EPA meetings? So he says, the ones about the waste pit, the ones down there at the end of the river bottom.
We have this lady back here.
By 2014, Greg was a regular at those Superfund meetings.
Hi. Can you guys hear me okay? Yes. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Jackie Young. I work out here.
He was inspired by Jackie Young, a woman from Highlands, a small community on the other side of the river. She lived even closer to the pits than Greg did, and she believed her debilitating health problems, seizures, hair loss, painful lesions all over her body, were linked to the Superfund site.
She'd get up in front of the EPA and scream and yell at them and all that and tell them they want to do these tests and that tests and all that. She's going to get something done. She's a little girl, you know. I wouldn't expect her to take on the management from the EPA, but she was kind of fearless.
So we trust you, and you guys are misleading these people.
The more Greg learned about the waste pits, the angrier he got. The stories he'd heard for years about sick neighbors and entire families battling cancer suddenly made sense.
A friend of mine had 3 grandchildren, no history of thyroid problems. And how did 3 kids get thyroid cancer? Little kids. How did 3 little kids end up with thyroid cancer? How did one family, both parents and one of the sons, die from cancer? And they lived kitty corner to the one's grandkids with thyroid cancer. And it's not just the luck of the draw, you know. I mean, there's something in the environment that caused that stuff.
Greg's biggest fear used to be that a barge would come careening down the river during a storm and dump chemicals into the water near his home. Now he had something new to worry about. What if a runaway barge rammed into the Superfund site and released dioxin, plus its own load of chemicals into the river?
The Channelview woman charged with hiring a contract murderer to kill the mother of a middle school cheerleader is out on bond today.
In July of 2014, something happened that put Channelview in the national headlines for the first time since the early 90s. That's when Wanda Holloway, aka the Pom Pom Mom, tried to hire a hitman to boost her daughter's chances of making the high school cheer team. This time, the spotlight was on a gun-toting senior citizen, angry about the barges moving into her neighborhood.
A 90-year-old grandmother clutching her shotgun as SWAT teams prepared to move in. That gun was loaded, and construction workers nearby told police she kept aiming it at them. She'd done it before, but today was different.
Yep, a 90-year-old woman with a shotgun.
What would make a 90-year-old grandma threaten violence? Neighbors say it's because she's fighting for her home. Barge construction companies surround her small house. Negotiators and SWAT teams had to move in, convinced her to drop the gun, rushed along the side of the house, and took her into custody.
Eloise Adcock had lived on Lakeside Drive for 46 years. Her riverfront home was just a few houses down from Carolyn's. Mrs. Adcock had always been a quiet woman, but watching her serene neighborhood become a chemical dumping ground, seeing her longtime neighbors sell out to barge companies, and the constant barrage of noise finally drove her over the edge.
Yeah, she's the last holdout. She just don't want to sell. Her husband built that house, and that's where she wants to stay.
Carolyn didn't know Mrs. Adcock well, but she'd watched barge companies snatch up properties on both sides of the old woman's home.
When all that commotion's going on each side of her, trucks running pretty much 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And I know our house was rattling and shaking and stuff from construction. I can only imagine what she was putting up with. My feelings is they were doing it on purpose to try to run her off her property, to get her to sell them their property.
Greg felt for the old woman too. He'd watched barge companies swarm into South Channelview, and he wanted to make sure the same thing didn't happen near him. But Greg was a bit of a lone wolf. He couldn't see himself working on committees or organizing people. And he didn't trust government, any kind of government, to help ordinary people like him and his friends.
Whoever has the money is who the government seems to listen to. These big companies, they know who to pay. And that's where a lot of people don't trust the government anymore.
Every once in a while, Greg thought about just leaving the river bottom, getting out while he could. But the more Superfund meetings he sat through, the more he realized that, like it or not, he was going to have to do something to help his community. Instead of moving, he decided to stay and fight in his own rough style. As I've said before, Greg is one of a kind. In a place like Channelview, where handshake deals are binding and news travels fastest through gossip, that matters. His bright white hair and mustache make him stand out physically, and his tendency to stop and talk with everyone makes him well known around town. Greg also has a lot of time on his hands. He doesn't drink, he doesn't smoke, he rarely stays up past 9, and he's always up by sunrise. So he decided to make himself a bullhorn in the fight against the barges and the waste pits. In his words, he became, quote, "that asshole who'd keep talking until you listened." I saw Greg in action at El Tejano, a beloved Tex-Mex spot where he's a regular.
Away from the TV, though.
Big grin on his face, voice booming as he talked over the TV blaring behind us. The waitress, Anna, knew his order by heart.
What does Greg normally have?
Chicken, whatever's chicken, potato, tacos.
But he also always has a pink lemonade?
Yes.
Big glass of pink lemonade and pollo a la parrilla. She called him Greggy.
If I don't come, she threatens to call me up.
He pulled neighbors aside wherever he went, like the man he lovingly referred to as Junkyard Joe, and another who simply went by the mayor.
That's a good nickname. Do you call him that, Junkyard Joe?
Yeah. Everybody calls him Junkyard Joe.
Greg also posted announcements on Facebook about EPA meetings, news articles, and Jackie Young's tireless work. He always made the same point. The people of Channelview needed to band together before it was too late.
I wanted it cleaned up so no more little kids get hurt. I mean, a kid should grow up and have fun and live a good life. They shouldn't be hooked up to a machine 4 or 5 times a week to cleanse their blood. They shouldn't die when they're 22 years old.
Greg did something else too. Something that, looking back on it, made him some powerful enemies. For months, he'd been playing with drones, fitting them with GoPro cameras. He'd always loved photography, and using the new technology was fun. But by 2015, the drones were part of his crusade. He monitored the waste pits from above and documented the movement of the barges that were inching closer to the pits and to the river bottom. Some of his friends thought he was wasting his time. They figured that no matter what Greg found, nothing would change. That regulators, in particular the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, didn't care about the people without money or connections. Greg's friends felt like they were expendable. Other friends warned of something more ominous, that Greg was going to piss off the barge companies that were snatching up land across the river bottom. There's one more thing you should know about Greg. He doesn't shrink from big moments. He lives for them. The man is an adrenaline junkie, a self-described speed freak. Drag racing cars, drag racing boats. He craves the tension that grips his body when he's wrestling nature behind the wheel of a powerful machine.
When that green light turns on, your adrenaline goes sky high. You know, it's something you really got to experience to understand. I mean, you just can't explain it. But the most powerful drug in the world is a green light.
That same fearlessness fueled Greg's fight against the barges. He ignored his friends' warnings. He kept flying his drones.
You have to document things. If you don't document it, people can deny it. If you got something on picture, they cannot deny it. Hopefully, if you have enough problems documented with the barges, they have to go out and fix it.
By this time, mid-2015, the Port of Houston was the nation's largest importer and exporter of petroleum products, including plastics found in everyday items like shoes, disposable coffee cups, and clothing. The ship channel needed more barges to ferry chemicals and fuel between plants and ships. All those barges needed parking spaces, and real estate along the ship channel was scarce.
Well, we got to go somewhere because they're putting more and more barges in the system, and you can't put them on the ship channel because the economics don't work since the deep draft guys have more at stake. So the terminals and the money being thrown around there and the depth you have forces the barges to go elsewhere.
That's Tom Marion, vice president and lawyer for Buffalo Marine, one of several interconnected barge companies that were already operating in South Channelview back then. Buffalo was docking barges on Lakeside Drive, just a few lots down from Carolyn's house. One of the connected companies, Holtmar Land, was also buying up property in the river bottom, near Greg's house. Tom spent 25 years in the Coast Guard, where one of his specialties was barge regulation.
The Coast Guard is the primary regulatory agency when it comes to vessels on navigable waters in the United States. The brown, we call the barges, that's the brown water component of the fleet. The guys that go beyond the sea buoy that sail the seven seas, we call that blue water. So in the Coast Guard, you want to make sure that the dance of commerce moves safely and efficiently, especially since the brown water fleet is by far the largest composition of the U.S. flag fleet.
Among the businesses Tom regulated was the company that now employs him, Buffalo Marine.
The thing about Buffalo Marine that was unique is that they were the company that was fueling the largest number of ships that came into the Houston Ship Channel. So at one point I ran into Pat Stutter, who's the CEO of the Buffalo Marine, at a function, and he said, hey, how come you guys keep calling me? Are you spying on me or something like that? I said, no, I know you fuel all the ships, so I want to make sure that we don't have a massive slowdown, because if you interrupt the stream of commerce, it can cost industry hundreds of millions of dollars. I guess he figured I was conscientious, so years later he hired me.
Tom helped me understand why barges are so crucial to the petrochemical industry.
People need to get goods to market efficiently, effectively. So the barges, while they're large and they're lumbering and they don't move as fast as the trains or the trucks, every barge takes 70 trucks off the road or 45 rail cars.
One by one, Carolyn's neighbors with riverfront homes sold out to barge companies. It was as if another oil rush had swept through Channelview. Except the companies weren't fighting for oil. They were fighting for a newly precious commodity, land along the San Jacinto, where they could park their barges between trips into the ship channel.
It just snowballed without no common sense by the governing agencies to protect the people, the residents.
Tom Marion lives 25 miles north of Channelview, in a $1 million house near 5 golf courses and Lake Houston, where people swim, boat, and water ski. In a series of follow-up emails, I asked Tom, what would he do if barges moved into his lakeside community? He never answered. The industrial invasion wasn't the only thing changing the face of Channelview. Its demographics had changed too. People who'd sold their waterfront property to industry moved away. So did a lot of workers with high-paying jobs in the petrochemical plants. This mass exodus, paired with Houston's exploding population, brought new people to Channelview searching for a cheap place to live. In 1990, 69% of Channelview's population was white. Only 19% was Hispanic. By 2010, the white population had shrunk to 22%. The percentage of Hispanic residents had more than tripled to 60%. Allison Cohen is an assistant professor of epidemiology at the University of California, San Francisco. She studies industrial pollution across the world. She said what happened in Channelview was predictable. When communities become industrialized, those left behind tend to be poorer and have less political power.
The people living in the communities most affected by environmental pollution are not necessarily also benefiting economically from working in the facilities that are polluting. The commonality among all these different communities facing environmental justice concerns tends to be that there's a history of systemic marginalization. And so as we think about the right to live, work, play, and learn in a place that is healthy, that right is not necessarily equitably distributed.
George Galindo was part of that wave of change. I met George outside his South Channelview home. It was a brisk February afternoon. He's stout and strong, a nod to his past work as a scaffold builder on industrial sites in East Harris County. He was wearing a black t-shirt emblazoned with the words Galindo Smokers. That's the business he runs out of his home. He builds custom barbecue grills and smokers using old propane tanks. George's father moved to the area in the late 90s, just as the big shift began. Settling in Channelview allowed his dad to be close to his job at the chemical plants, without living side by side with them.
Whenever we moved in Channelview, I feel like there's a lot more older white people, or just white people in general. Now it's just mostly us Mexicans.
At first, the Galindos enjoyed many of the things that drew Carolyn there decades earlier. George grew up playing at the same Riverside Park where Bobby and Carolyn hung out as teenagers.
That was a spot to be, back then. Friday, Saturday, Sundays, and everybody would be out there barbecuing, fishing, having a good family time. We would catch fish. We'll bring them home and eat them. And that was just our small little hobby or little together time me and my dad had growing up.
But within a few years, the river was so polluted that George and his father stopped fishing from it, and nobody swam in it. The stench of chemicals floating off barges parked nearby and the grinding noise from the tugboats that pushed them became a part of daily life. More Latinos moved in, unaware of the dangers surrounding them.
A lot of people in this area don't know English, and they're not going to want to argue with the state or some kind of official, They're just going to take the way of life and be grateful that, they're even here. But they might not know, the dangers that they're going to, get exposed to.
Without a mayor or city council to fight on their behalf, Channelview's newcomers and old-timers were left to fend for themselves. The Texas Commission on Environmental Quality occasionally monitored Channelview for pollution. When it did, the agency found problems. In 2002, the TCEQ placed part of South Channelview and the San Jacinto River on the agency's air pollutant watch list. Regulators were worried about benzene, a chemical that's long been linked to leukemia. In 2003, the area was placed on the watch list again, this time for having high levels of airborne styrene. The World Health Organization says styrene is a probable human carcinogen. In 2005 and 2006, a year before K-Solve caught fire, a team of TCEQ air monitoring experts zeroed in on Carolyn's neighborhood. The fumes were so strong outside of K-Solve that 2 of them reported that their eyes started burning, and they got headaches immediately. Public Health Watch filed a series of open records requests with the TCEQ about these incidents. Documents showed that the agency was especially concerned about K-Solve and a handful of barge companies near Carolyn. Residents weren't told any of this. The agency didn't make anyone available to be interviewed for this podcast. In an emailed statement, a spokesperson said the experts' findings, quote, triggered actions at TCEQ that include placement of stationary air monitors, evaluation of air monitoring data, and follow-up investigations of potential pollutant sources. In a series of emails, K-Solve's CEO, Todd Riddle, pointed to other companies and nearby chemical barges as the primary sources of benzene pollution. He said his company spends, quote, hundreds of thousands of dollars annually to limit and prevent any harmful emissions of any substance. In April of 2015, Carolyn was on her front porch, sifting through her mail, when she pulled out a plain white envelope from the city of Houston. She lived in unincorporated Channelview. Why was the city of Houston sending her mail?
We're within the 5-mile extraterritorial jurisdiction of the city of Houston, which means that while we have no ability to vote or any say, any representation, they can tell us what we can and can't do.
Inside was a short letter from Houston's Department of Planning and Development, saying it had received, quote, an application to allow a partial replatting of the Lakeview Homes addition. The application was filed on behalf of Harley Marine, which is now called Centerline Logistics. The Seattle-based company specializes in moving petroleum across the country, with fleets on the East, West, and Gulf coasts. Carolyn had no idea what a replat was, and she didn't have a fancy real estate lawyer to help her. So she did what anyone else would do. She Googled it. After getting lost on a few message boards, she was pretty sure that a replat is basically a way to change the boundaries of a subdivision and its parcels of land. According to the letter, the purpose of this replat was to create something called, quote, an unrestricted reserve.
Our first reaction, mine and my neighbors, was, what the heck is an unrestricted reserve? What do they mean? You know, because we didn't have a clue. Just an unrestricted reserve is kind of a frightening term, especially when you live in Harris County.
The properties across the street from Carolyn's house were filled with trees and some empty houses, the last remnants of the neighbors who'd once lived there. A few barges already lined the properties, and according to the letter, a whole lot more were about to move in.
I called City of Houston Planning and Development and asked what that was, and they explained what it meant, that they were trying to remove our restrictions so they could build the facility.
Those restrictions Carolyn's referring to are the residential zoning restrictions that were guaranteed in the deed to her house. Houston and Harris County have notoriously loose zoning laws, which means industries sometimes sit side by side with homes and schools. But Carolyn and Bobby had always thought their deed protected them. Carolyn showed me the deed. It said, quote, all lots, plots, or parcels of land shall be used for private residence purposes only. Its stance on heavy industry was clear. Quote, no noxious or offensive industry, business, or activity shall be carried on upon any lot, nor shall anything be done on any lot to which may be or become an annoyance or nuisance to the neighborhood. Suddenly, any sense of security Carolyn and Bobby had left was gone. As Carolyn and I talked, a steady stream of large trucks whooshed by her front yard.
It's extremely frustrating and aggravating, especially since we purposely sought out the safest area in Channelview to live.
A week later, Carolyn received a second letter from the city of Houston. Harley Marine didn't want to commercialize just one residential plot of land. They wanted to combine several into one big commercial plot. Carolyn called the city's planning department. They told her the only way she and her neighbors could stop this from happening was to show up to a public hearing in a couple of weeks. So Carolyn and her neighbor went to a meeting in downtown Houston.
Neither one of us had ever been to a public hearing or anything, but, it concerned us. Well, we get down there, and we're waiting, and we look down on the agenda and see that it's been withdrawn.
When Carolyn got home, she called the planning department again. Yes, she was told, Harley Marine had pulled its application.
He said they withdrew it because they were going to be denied anyway, because our restrictions prohibited it, and they had the legal determination from City of Houston Legal Department. So that was it. We thought it was over and done with. There would not be a facility over there.
By Thanksgiving, Carolyn had pushed Harley Marine out of her thoughts. She and Bobby drove to Atascocita, the Houston suburb where their 2 kids and 3 grandchildren lived. While the others played cornhole and sat around the fire pit, Carolyn whipped up carrot cake. It's a Stone family tradition. They didn't talk about Harley Marine the entire day. But the next morning, back home in Channelview, Carolyn saw something across the street that made her, quote, want to punch somebody. A big white sign was stuck in front of the sprawling piece of land. It showed a mock-up of a 2-story building. In capital letters, it announced, Harley Marine Gulf, future home of regional headquarters.
It was like that, what the hell moment? How did this happen? We had this stop.
Carolyn called the planning department again. She also called Harris County's engineering department.
Yeah, I was freaking out. I was not very calm about it. I wasn't cussing or yelling or screaming or anything. I was laying out the facts and being pretty adamant of, what are y'all doing? How is this happening?
Both agencies assured her that Harley Marine's permit applications had been pulled, regardless of what the sign across the street from her house said. But Carolyn didn't trust the government. She was tired of sitting back and watching the petrochemical industry do whatever it wanted. That night, she dug out her clunky old laptop and began researching Texas property law. She stayed up late, poring over legal documents and taking notes. She created a timeline that tracked every letter, every legal filing, every piece of evidence that could help her fight back. She knew she was in over her head, but what she lacked in formal training and real estate know-how, she could make up for in persistence.
Trying to figure out who to go talk to is very, very difficult. Took a crash course on the Texas legal code to see, why this was happening.
The more Carolyn learned, the more she peppered Harris County and the city of Houston with phone calls and emails. She said everyone insisted that Harley Marine's plans were on hold. But the sign stayed put. And after a few months, the government agencies stopped answering her calls.
I didn't know what was going on, but I know that I wasn't getting my phone calls returned. There seemed to be some very deep corruption going on. And I hate to say that, but I want to be wrong. Prove me wrong. Please, somebody prove me wrong.
I reached out repeatedly to Harris County's engineering department and Houston's planning department to ask about their interactions with Carolyn. Both agencies declined to be interviewed for this podcast, The county sent me an email saying it was, quote, unable to confirm or deny the validity of Ms. Stone's claims at this time and have no further statement to provide. The city stopped responding to me entirely. 4 months later, on a Saturday morning in March of 2016, another letter showed up in Carolyn's mailbox. Carolyn isn't the fainting type. She's not dramatic enough for that. But she nearly blacked out with rage when she read what was inside.
Dear Mr. and Mrs. Stone, Harley Marine Gulf is pleased to announce that we are starting this week to build our regional headquarters in Channelview. We apologize in advance for any inconvenience our construction may cause, and we will do our utmost to minimize any impact to you. My reaction was disappointment, frustration, anger, and such a, I don't even know how to put it in words, disillusionment with our governing entities, because you still always in the back of your mind, you think that they are out there to abide by the law and to protect where they can.
Because it was a Saturday, the city and county offices were closed. So Carolyn spent the weekend preparing for the calls she'd make first thing Monday morning. She talked to every neighbor she could. She laid out the tools she'd assembled over the last year. The list of government workers and phone numbers, her home's original deed, and the zoning restrictions created for her subdivision in 1944. She tried to distract herself with gardening, but instead of admiring the roses that were budding in her front yard, all she could see was that Harley Marine sign taunting her from across the street. She couldn't stop thinking, how could they let Harley do this? Carolyn set her alarm for 6:30 a.m. Monday, but Harley Marine beat her to the punch.
They had the street lined with equipment Monday morning before daybreak, and they went in and they mowed everything down. They mowed all the trees down and the residential houses down as quickly as they could, so they destroyed everything.
Carolyn frantically called the county, the city. She even called the office of the most powerful man in Houston, the county attorney. She said everyone empathized with her situation, but nobody was willing to actually do something to help.
It was a moment of extreme desperation, I guess. It's like being in the penthouse of a skyscraper in the elevator and the brakes failing and you're plummeting down. There's no stopping and you're pushing buttons. So you're calling all these people and, you're getting various responses. Oh, this is horrible. This should not be happening. Then they hang up from you.
The city and county declined to discuss their interactions with Carolyn that day. The next morning, Carolyn woke to the sound of heavy machinery again. Harley Marine's workers were back at it. She rolled out of bed and started making calls. After another game of phone tag, she got a call back from the city.
They contacted me back and said that it wasn't replatted, it was an amended plat.
Unlike a replat, which the barge company had tried in 2015, an amended plat allowed the barge company to combine several lots without a public hearing. Carolyn was fuming. The city and county hadn't told her any of this. The way she saw it, Harley Marine had pulled a fast one. But amended plat or not, her neighborhood still had deed restrictions. None of it made sense. Harley Marine pushed ahead with construction.
Oh, they would work late into the night, and then they would start before daybreak, revving up equipment, using the headlights and stuff to get things started. And there was no blocking out the noise. We live in a little wooden house that was built in the 30s. We'd shake stuff off the shelves. You would actually feel the vibrations within you and stuff. And, the dust and debris. We used to really keep our curtains open and windows open. We couldn't use our attic fan. We closed our curtains.
Carolyn felt trapped. Like a lot of people in Texas, she and Bobby owned guns. But frontier justice hadn't saved Grandma Adcock, and she knew it wouldn't save her either. Carolyn was especially frustrated by what she didn't know. She couldn't understand how her neighborhood's deed restrictions were so easily cast aside, or why the government agencies had stopped answering her calls. But how could she get answers if nobody would talk to her? Then, one March afternoon, it came to her. She would file an open records request. One of her neighbors had suggested that months before. How could she have forgotten? An open records request is an application to receive publicly available information from a government agency. Carolyn had never filed one. It was yet another thing she had to learn how to do. After a little internet research, she decided to ask for everything she could think of: internal emails, external emails, documents, meeting notes, permits. She filled out the submission forms on the city and county websites, triple-checked her work, and hit submit. Less than 2 weeks later, a trove of documents showed up on Carolyn's computer. Inside was a series of emails between Harley Marine and the city's planning department. They proved something Carolyn had suspected. At first, the city really had intended to deny Harley Marine's application. In one email, dated April 28, 2015, Harley Marine's project manager asked the city's planning department for an update.
Just wanted to see if you'd received any information from the legal department regarding the above plat and the variance request. Thanks.
10 minutes later, the city responded.
It violates restrictions. Would you like to withdraw?
If that didn't make it clear, the city's next email did.
Call the legal department. Remember to formally request a withdrawal or the city will be forced to disapprove.
Harley Marine withdrew its replat request 2 days after that email exchange. Armed with this information, Carolyn and her neighbor fired off a letter to Harley Marine's chairman and CEO, Harley Franco. They enclosed a copy of their subdivision's zoning restrictions and copies of the emails showing that the city of Houston had originally vetoed the project. The letter was dated April 5th, 2016. It was titled, Notice of Violation of Land Use Restrictions.
Mr. Franco, please be advised Harley Marine Services and their personnel, representatives, agents, and assigns are in violation of the recorded and unexpired restrictions and are detrimental to the health, welfare, and environment of the residents of Lakeview Homes Addition subdivision. Harley Marine Services and entities are to cease all activities not in accordance with the recorded and unexpired restrictions.
Carolyn sounded like the self-taught lawyer she had become.
They thought they could come in and that this was a low-educated area, low-income area, that people would not have the intelligence to fight them, would cower down to their superiority, is what they were counting on, was that we were not smart enough to know we were being wronged, duped, crapped on.
That same month, Greg Moss stepped up his efforts to monitor the barges moving closer to the waste pits. 5 years had passed since he first heard about the Superfund site. He'd learned a lot since then. About advocacy, about Channelview, about himself. He'd become close friends with Jackie Young, the woman he'd admired at those early EPA meetings. She'd started her own nonprofit, the Texas Health and Environment Alliance. Jackie relied on Greg and his drones to keep track of what was going on near the waste pits. After every expedition, he loaded the pictures onto his computer and sent Jackie the standouts.
Now you can see the pitch.
He'd found his purpose.
Well, it's something to do that's doing good instead of just going fishing or whatever, At least it's doing some good for somebody, for the community.
That purpose also weighed on him. Sometimes he wished he didn't know so much about the environmental threats that surrounded him, that he could just live in blissful ignorance. But what kept him going, what kept him angry, was that so little had been done to clean up the waste pits. The federal government had put a temporary cap on them in 2011. But that wasn't a long-term solution. Not with the San Jacinto continuing to rise. Not with the threat of the next big hurricane looming on the horizon. On April 20th, 2016, 15 days after Carolyn and her neighbors sent their letter to Harley Marine, Carolyn got one in return. Only, it wasn't from Harley Franco, the company's CEO. It was from Reed C. Wilson, a prominent Houston real estate lawyer who specializes in land use and zoning. Reed Wilson has connections across the state. He's chaired the real estate, probate, and trust law section of the State Bar of Texas. He's also been recognized repeatedly by Best Lawyers, one of the nation's most renowned legal publications. Carolyn gulped and tore open the letter.
As you both have known since at least November last year, when you complained to Harris County, Harley has planned a multi-million-dollar project to construct its regional headquarters on Lakeside Drive across from your homes. It is obvious to any reasonable person, whether using Google Earth or driving down Lakeside Drive, that the Harley property is and has been industrial in use and a character for many, many years. As Harley has the legal right to use and develop its property, it will aggressively defend any action seeking to interfere with those rights, including but not limited to seeking damages permitted by law. Very truly yours, Reed C. Wilson.
When I first read Reed Wilson's letter, I was shocked by the gravity of his words. A powerful lawyer openly threatening to sue Carolyn if she kept causing problems. Carolyn said the letter made her feel less than human, like a pest that Harley and its bigwig law firm was trying to eradicate.
They have a legal right to use their property and to aggressively defend it. To imply that we as residents don't have those same rights is deeply offending and demeaning. It's a show of attitude that they are so much more superior to all of us. That, as he says, we're not being reasonable expecting that we should live in a better environment.
I reached out to Reed Wilson a dozen times to ask him about this letter, but he never responded. I asked Harley Marine, now called Centerline Logistics, about the letter too. The company's lawyer told me, quote, "The Centerline entities are subject to confidentiality restrictions, and therefore the Centerline entities will decline to provide comment." Carolyn stewed over Reed Wilson's letter for weeks. She was overmatched, and she knew it. So she doubled down on her effort to find a lawyer, someone who was gutsy enough, maybe even crazy enough, to take on a big-time barge company in the epicenter of the Texas petrochemical industry. If this were my story, it might have ended here. If I were Greg, I probably wouldn't have monitored the barges and waste pits for so many years. And if I were Carolyn, I probably would have surrendered the day Harley Marine's bulldozers rolled in, or the moment I got Reed Wilson's threatening letter. How could two ordinary people possibly defeat not just the petrochemical industry, but government agencies too? But Carolyn and Greg have something not many people have. A mulish instinct to dig in and push back against anyone trying to harm them or the people they love. True Texas grit. To put it bluntly, they do no harm, but they take no shit.
My great-grandfather was a Golden Gloves boxer. Plus, my daddy was a welder, so we were his welder's helpers, and we're always moving heavy iron and different things and stuff. So we were pretty strong and feisty bunch. No one ever messed with me in school, but I would go out of my way to avoid a confrontation. But if you were messing with my friends, I was not going to stand idly by and let them be harmed. I would stand up for my friends.
Next time on Fumed, Greg and Carolyn joined forces as the stakes rise in embattled Channelview. And Carolyn finally gets the legal help she so desperately needs.
It was that kind of relief. Even now, I get kind of choked up talking about it because it was such a moment. You know, it was, you're drowning and you finally get the life ring around you and it's being pulled in.
Fumed is a production of Public Health Watch. It was written and reported by me, David Leffler. Additional reporting by Savanna Strott and Salina Arredondo. Susan White was my editor. Our executive producer was Jordan Gass-Pooré. Our senior producer was Salina Arredondo. Savanna Strott was an assistant producer. Jana Cholakovska and Jordan Gass-Pooré provided additional research. Our music was composed and performed by Michael Ramos. Additional music by Epidemic Sound. Mark Bush was our sound engineer. Fact-checking by Enna Alvarado. Artwork by Matthew Fleming. Special thanks to our distribution partners at Texas Public Radio and to the Texas Tribune for studio and technical support. Also, thanks to Joanne Farian, Lynn Perry, and Chris Worthington for their advice and encouragement. Jim Morris is the Executive Director and Editor-in-Chief of Public Health Watch. To see pictures of Carolyn and Greg and learn more about Channelview, go to fumedpodcast.com. Hey, it's David again. I hope you'll consider donating to Public Health Watch, the nonprofit news outlet that produced Fumed. Go to publichealthwatch.org to contribute. Thanks.